Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 14th edition of the BigFooty Bombers podcast for season 2021. I am again your host, Bonster34, and I am joined this evening by Sporno for Pyros. Have I said that correctly, mate?
That's correct. Sporno for Pyros.
Here we go. That's all. I was just making sure because last time we had you on, Jamu was the host. The B team, as I like to think of him.
He was all across the name, rhyming with the band Porno for Pyros. So
he wasn't completely useless, is what you're saying, which is I'm sure he'll be pleased to hear when he listens to this. Now we're also joined by another person who's become a fairly regular on this show, and that's Kyptastic. How are you, mate?
Thanks for having me, Bonster. And Sporno, welcome to the A-Team. This is the serious stuff here. We don't stuff around. This is the serious, hard-hitting podcast that you would have come to expect, I hope.
That's good fun. Looking forward to tonight, fellas.
Yeah, so we will jump straight in and we'll touch on the game against Sydney on the weekend. Now, Kip, I saw the first three quarters. I did miss the last quarter, so I probably missed things at the point end, which is it does appear like we may have faded a little bit in the last quarter. But for the first three quarters, I was actually fairly pleased with the effort. We certainly ran with them, and they are going to be a finals team. So to be able to run with a finals team as well as we did, for me, is a pleasing sign. And I thought it was probably our best game for a few weeks. I thought we'd been down and lacking energy, and I think we certainly brought the energy that we saw earlier in the season to the game against Sydney on the weekend.
Absolutely. It's the best game since the West Coast game for mine, even though we lost. Just that Rutten spoke a lot about playing the game that we want to play. And I think for the most part, we did that. I did see at the start Sydney were trying to play that same game style that North and GWS played against us. But the fact that we were able to get in front, and then Sydney did get back in front at the start of the third quarter, but we sort of went goal for them for the rest of the game. And I think that shows that we really committed to the game style as much as possible. There obviously are things lacking, and that comes from being a young team. But I don't think people should be disappointed with the effort. Obviously, there are a few execution areas. And as you said, Sydney are a really good side. They're charging through, threatening top four. I think it's a really good result for where we're at, but just a few small changes need to be made before we do start taking out to teams like Sydney. What did you think, Sporno?
Yeah, a bit like you, Kip. I must admit I was a bit worried going into the match, because, Sydney's been red hot the last few weeks, just like they were at the start of the year. So to go toe-to-toe with them was really pleasing, and I'd be lying if I said I saw every second of the match, but what I saw was like, gee, they're looking good, and, it was really pleasant to see, because I think we've all been a bit disheartened by the last few weeks, and this week they really stepped up.
Yeah, Sport, I do just want to touch on something Kip did say, though, and that was Sydney sort of approached the game the same way that, North Melbourne and GWS did in that chip style. And I think I posted, 3 or 4 times, and I think I got a few likes about the chip. We didn't plan for it, or if we planned for it, we didn't execute it again. Now, I have said before that maybe it comes down to Rutten, and it was pointed out, well, Rutten wouldn't have said to the players, don't man up. But Rutten surely needs to have a better game plan in the players' minds, because the players themselves don't go out there expecting to let the Swans just chip all the way up the field like they did. It's a breakdown on both sides, I think. I think it's the coach and also the players not executing properly, and maybe just a little bit of lack of communication between a new coach and a young playing group towards the back end of the season.
I think we see with the Rutten game style the willingness to see the opposition's back half, sort of push them wide, let them do that chip, and then use our interceptors like your Ridleys and Laverty's played a really good role intercepting Redmond and the like to get the ball back, and then push forward, use a Nick Hind, speed through the middle, and then good disposal by Zach Merritt to get the ball forward, possibly because our forward line at the moment isn't very lead oriented, and so it becomes, if we go slow, it becomes very stagnant. We're trying to some way play some sort of slingshot effort. I mean, there's problems with the front half pressure, because obviously Tip and Woody is down. Selling being back is a big in for that and helping with that. And I think Dylan Clark played a bit of that role as well. And I think that's one reason why Sydney didn't get on top as much with that game style as GWS did last week. There's a bit of a harder edge from our players. But it does seem to be a genuine tactic to let them out that way. And sometimes if the players aren't fully concentrating, it just seems very easy for teams to move all the way from back to forward. I don't know if there's stats on this, but I would say that we've probably conceded the most goals from kick-ins without one of our players touching the ball
Yeah, I'd say that's been a bit of a frustrating thing for all of us fans watching at home to see sides doing that chipping around, and it seems to pay off really well against Essendon, or it has the last few weeks. But I noticed that it's been apparently a trend across the league. I think Collingwood had over 150 marks, uncontested marks on the weekend. What I saw of Geelong and North Melbourne, and very similar sort of thing where Geelong were just chipping. So I've heard people sort of say it might be a tactic to try and overcome the stand on the mark technique. So and maybe we haven't adapted to that just yet.
Yeah, and it may very well be a tactic to avoid the man of the mark rule. I think maybe the man of the mark rule, it had a pretty big impact early on, but I feel like teams have sort of adjusted now and are setting their zones a little bit better. And I think maybe the umpires have been a little bit more lenient on it than we expected, or certainly more lenient than what was advertised by the AFL. The AFL were adamant that you took half a step, you'd be gone. But I think we've seen that there is still a little bit of creeping going on, not a great deal. And the other thing is with that standing on the mark is players have got a little bit smarter too. So you can actually stand anywhere within, I think it's so where the player takes the mark, you can stand 5 metres to the left, 5 metres to the right, 5 metres behind, and you've sort of got like almost a mini semicircle set up. And I think players are now standing more inboard in that they're not actually standing the mark, they're standing more inboard and probably a little bit further back, which probably does have the same effect as creeping around on the mark, because if you're already there, that quick movement inboard, which is what the AFL was hoping to see, is not as easy to execute. But I think the most pleasing thing for me was that we saw the return of Darcy Parish to what I actually think will be his All-Australian form. And look, we'll probably move away from the Sydney game because while it was a better performance, it was a loss. So I don't want to dwell on it too much for our listeners. So Kip, I'll start with you, mate. Darcy Parish, I think, is probably our biggest lock for All-Australian this year. Jared Healy, I think, said earlier in the season that he was an absolute lock. All he had to do was prove he could beat a tag. Now, I don't know if he has proven he could beat a tag, but that's still only been 1 or 2 down games. For the rest of the year, he's been sensational. And I would be stunned if he's not at least on the bench for the All-Australian side this year.
He's definitely got the most hype. I think I'm not sure if he's still the leading clearance player in the game. I don't know if Liberatore's taken that back after a couple of quiet weeks, but to be one of the top 2 or 3 clearance players in the game and to have improved his kicking so much, it's just outstanding. I think it can be hard for that sort of first-timer player. They're really making their name for themselves to get on. Often that's an easy person to cut in the All-Australian look, but I think that given his high profile and the support that he's getting from members of the media, I think there's definitely an All-Australian spot for him. I think you're underselling Zach Merritt, though. I think they're both... Zach Merritt is a victim of his own standards. He's probably had his best year. I think if you look at his game yesterday, that was a complete game, and he hasn't been as impacted by a tag as Darcy has. I think if Darcy's a lock for All-Australian, I can't see Merritt being much further behind. Spornos, what do you think? Do you think Darcy's had the better year, or is Merritt a bit better?
I guess Darcy's had it in the big matches is where he's sort of been on Broadway where he's had his big matches. So Anzac Day, Dreamtime, the Farmers match where he all got best on ground in all 3 of those. So I was there thinking, oh, gee, he's really tracking for All-Australian. But, the positions for midfield get pretty crammed. I mean, you've got to fit Bontempelli in there. You'll have to fit probably Petrarca in there. Sam Walsh has been having a crack over the season, so it's going to be pretty tight for some of those midfield positions. So, if people start to look at just his last 2 weeks and they go, he's been a bit off the last 2 weeks for Parish, that might go against him slightly. But I would think either Parish or Merritt, one of them's definitely got to make it onto the bench. But it's a bit of a boys' club sometimes, the All-Australians selections, and we've seen in the past where people who have a big name might get in on reputation. And I think, like you sort of said, Parish might make the squad, but may not make the final team just due to football politics.
Well, he might actually slide into that half-forward flank role because, as we know, the All-Australian side certainly doesn't mind sticking the midfielders into the pockets and the flanks if there's no room in on the ball. So I think he should still make the team. And I do think you're right, though, Kip. I think Zach Merritt suffers from what I am now labelling the Jordan Ridley disease, in that he is a victim of his own excellence. It's just something that we've come to expect. And I think one of the commentators said on the weekend that there was a bit of, I suppose, there's a bit of negativity around Zach Merritt's disposal a couple of years ago. It was a lot of, he just gets these cheap kicks. But I certainly don't think he does those cheap kicks anymore. It's one of those ones that he seems to be just able to hit a target and be a little bit more aggressive by foot, which is something that we certainly love to see. And it's funny that you mentioned Sporno, blokes that get into the All-Australian side because of height. Because I, for one, am still absolutely filthy that Matthew Pavlich got the All-Australian full back in the early 2000s over Dustin Fletcher, despite the fact he actually never played at full back. He played centre-half back for the year, and they just decided to shove him into the last line and move poor old Fletcher out of the way.
I think Zachy's going a bit better in the Coaches' Awards as well than Das. Not a huge amount, probably one best on ground.
I just want to bring up AMT, Anthony McDonald-Tipperwhinney. I think 5 weeks ago, I think he was a lock in the forward pocket, that small forward position. Do either of you think these last 5 weeks are going to cost him his first All-Australian berth, or do you think he's done enough in the first 14 rounds of the season to justify that spot?
No, he's absolutely not going to get it now. You're right. He was on fire early in the year, and he would have been one of the absolute Monties to get it. But with 3 games to go, he's going to end up probably only kicking. Well, and I say only, but he's probably only end up getting that mid-30s total for goals. And I just don't see how they're going to slot him in, especially when you consider, as what I've just said before, midfielders do find their ways into those positions. If anyone in our forward line is going to get it, and Sporno, feel free to jump in and disagree, but I think Jake String is probably the forward from Essendon that would slot into the All-Australian side this year.
Well, I'm an unabashed Jake Stringer fan, and I think out of the 3, I think he's almost got to be the one. If one of the 3 had to make it, Jake Stringer on the weekend, even though he was mostly in the midfield doing some amazing clearance work, he kicks goals, and he has had a season. Well, he's had a better season than Dusty, if you ask me. And the commentators love to rave about Dusty, as we all know. So I would think Jake Stringer's definitely got to be in the mix there for a spot on the half-forward flank, even though that's not his primary position anymore. And it's just, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, a few years ago, back to Tipper, what's the goal sneak from Geelong, who he had about the first 6 weeks off because he was suspended by Steve Johnson, of course, Stevie J. He got suspended and didn't play for the first 6 weeks and still made the All-Australian side. But Tipper's definitely dropped off a cliff, unfortunately. But I've got my hopes on Jakey Stringer getting a go.
I think it was that was the 2007 Geelong Premiership year. I think Stevie J there. I think All-Australian selectors that year could have just picked the Geelong first 22, and I think people would have been happy with that one. But on Jake Stringer, I mean, if you look at his form since, I think I talked about this last time I was on, but his form since the Hawthorne game has been outstanding. He's doing that role that we want him to do. He had 9 clearances on the weekend, equal most on the ground, and he was one of those ones that was, when we had a goal kicked against us, it was our clearance work that was giving us the opportunity to respond, and he was the driving force behind that. I don't know whether the mid part of his year and missing some games would cost him in that, but the fact that he's coming home so strong and such a high profile, and having been an All-Australian in the past, I think he may sneak in on the half-forward line. And he actually would be a perfect fit for a half-forward because he plays forward and he rotates through the midfield, unlike some of the other midfielders that get put there, as he said.
Just on Stevie J's All-Australian, it was 2007, you are right, but he did kick 41 goals in 17 games and also managed to average just close to 19 touches a game, which is obviously a lot more than Tipper. So I take your point, Sporno, but I think Stevie J's season was miles better than unfortunately what AMT is going to end up delivering this year. It is interesting though that the other bloke, and I did mention his name before when we were talking about Zach Merritt being a victim of his own hype, and the other one from Essendon that's still a real red hot chance has to be Jordan Ridley. I mean, he's just gone about his work very quietly, very, very nonplussed each week, and just plays with such confidence and silk for a bloke his age. I mean, I don't know who else is going to be in the running down there. He doesn't provide that running, exciting dash off the half-back line like your Nick Hines and your Adam Sards, but he just has something that's just hard to replicate. And I think he certainly would, again, be in the mix for one of the back six positions. He'll certainly make the squad, I would have thought. And it's sort of amusing to me that we've probably got 4 blokes that should make the squad in Stringer, Parrish, Merritt and Ridley, even though we're not going to finish in the top 8. And all 4 of them probably have a genuine claim on a spot the side. And even though I don't think he should be there, Anthony McDonald-Tipungwuti is another player that's probably got a claims for us at least a spot in the squad. So it's pretty exciting, I think, that we've had such good individual seasons from some players this year. But yeah, I mean, what do you guys think about Ridley? Should he be in the side this year?
He's been as consistent as last year. It's just not as much of a standout because it's, he did it last year and he's doing the same thing again. I think teams, you often tend to overrate your own players. There's only 40 spots, and when we're saying there's 4 definites from a team that's struggling to make the 8, I think that's can be a bit of a fantasy. But there's no doubt he's playing as good a football as last year when he wasn't in that 40. I don't think there would be any debate about whether he deserved to be there if he was picked. But I think it also sort of does reflect on our season and sort of where we're at, that we do have a lot of these individual high performers, but as a whole, we're carrying a fair bit of a bottom end, and that's costing us in games. I mean, if you look at the stats from last week, if you look at the players over 20 disposals, there's only 4 Essendon players compared to 9 Sydney players. We're just too much is being carried by too few. Maybe they'll get that individual recognition, but it's holding us back from that team success that they all want.
Yeah, I think the fact that we've had a few guys like Laverde and Mason Redman step up again this year has sort of taken a bit of the spotlight off Ridley, because his season, as far as stats and everything goes, matches up to last year. So he should definitely be in the squad. But it's sort of interesting. Carlton's in a similar position to us. They've won 8 games, but they've got Sam Walsh, who should be in All-Australian. They've got the full forward, who should be All-Australian. Weeder in the fullback should have the fullback position. So they're probably a bit similar to us. They've had a few of their stars really perform and have great years. And then it's the depth players that you sort of mentioned there, Kip, that maybe have let both sides down.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say our depth players have let us down as such, but I think one of the big things we've found this year is our depth players are probably learning roles that they haven't been asked to play before, especially the ones you sort of mentioned there in Laverde, and James Stewart's another one that comes to mind, and even Redmond. I mean, Redmond was probably behind Connor McKenna and Adam Sard in that dashing run off the half-back line, and then they tried him on a wing, but did he really play that well on the wing? I'm not sure. I think he's found his role in the half-back. So I think you're right in saying that the role players probably haven't played as consistently well as we'd hope in their roles at times. But yeah, I just think that's because they're learning how to play this game style under Truck, certainly from our point of view. I mean, let's be honest, fuck Carlton. Who cares about them, really? Especially on this podcast. But I'm honestly not sure what Carlton's been like. I mean, I know there's certain posters on our board that love Carlton and think that they're the next big thing. I'm certainly not one of those, because I do look at their list and think there's a lot of junk still to be trimmed from it.
I might have been a bit harsh there on our role players, because, I mean, they have done a pretty good job this year. So you make a good point that, some of those guys like Redmond have stepped up where Connor McKenna were. So, yeah, I'll take your point there, Bonds.
The other thing I just want to mention quickly about the role players is something of a trend I've probably noticed on the board. And Kip, tell me if you think I'm being a little pedantic here or maybe imagining it. But James Stewart made a couple of errors on the game against Sydney, and all of a sudden it was, well, James Stewart's not the future. James Stewart this. We need to replace Stewart. A couple of errors in one game does not undo the fantastic work that James Stewart has done this year. I mean, he's learnt a new role and has played it exceptionally well for his first time at AFL level. And it sort of disappoints me a little bit with some of our posters when a player does one or two things poorly and all of a sudden it becomes well, they're not the future. We need to replace them. They're rubbish. Is that something that you've noticed on our board, or am I reading too much into a few comments that I saw on the weekend?
I think it's every board, Essendon board is as bad as this as any other board, any other forum where you look at people posting on Essendon. There's always people ready to stick the boot into certain players. Will Snelling cops it all the time, even though he's been fantastic. Every time Tom Cutlass is selected or Marty Gleeson is selected, there's heaps of people posting about how crap he is and he should never be near an AFL side. It's really just, if people are really quickly to make a judgment on players, And then when they see something that matches their judgment, they're really quick to post about how their judgment is right. And you don't see those people when those players play well. As soon as Aaron Francis, muffed a kick, there's an explosion of people, oh, he can never work as a forward. This is terrible. What's he doing there? Same with Stewart, as you point out. Stewart's played some fantastic games in the back line. Aaron Francis has been off for 4 weeks for mental health. He came back, switched roles. So he obviously been training as a defender all year, trained as a defender the last couple of years, and was asked to do the team thing and play a forwards game. And I thought he did some really good things. Some of his lead-up marks on the wing were very impressive. And I think there's something to work with at that. I think people are too quick to overlook what could be and what the potential positives are, and really quick to write off a lot of players. And you go into some of the threads about our list management, our list strategy. Some of the delisting lists are more than half the team. You can't do that, and people have value even if they're not the Zach Merritts or the Darcy Parish superstars. You need players to do certain things. You need players to do the hard things. You need a player to sit on a wing for a whole game, even though the ball might not come out that side the whole game. They end up with 10 disposals. And you're like, well, what a rubbish game. Well, they're playing their role. They're holding the space. So, look, knee-jerk reactions are a pretty standard response from a lot of people when it comes to football. We're obviously really passionate. We want our sides to do well. But I think there's real scope for people to be a bit more circumspect about how they talk about players, particularly on a lot of the social medias where they can access that. Seeing what we know about mental health, seeing what's happening with some of the things in the Olympics. I think that sort of attitude doesn't really help anyone. It doesn't make somewhere like the board a really good place to discuss things if people have such a hard line against certain players.
Yeah, and you've got to remember Stewart's probably playing against the best, probably the first or second best forward from the opposition side each week. And the way opposition sides transfer the ball from our forward line to their forward line is always under the pump. So I'm willing to cut the guy a fair bit of slack.
Now, there has been a bit of non-Essendon news that I do want to touch on this week because, geez, it made me laugh because, fuck me, Dad, who did not see the Alistair Clarkson, Sam Mitchell, Hawthorne love triangle exploding into a million pieces and falling apart quicker than after Luke Skywalker manages to fire off into the Death Star? I mean, Jesus Christ. How many examples did Hawthorne need to see before realising that a coaching handover like that just does not work? We saw it with Malthouse and Buckley. We've seen it ourselves with Worsfold and Rutten. I mean, Paul Roos and Goodwin, okay, that might have possibly worked, but Goodwin's still, there's still a lot of Demons fans out there who don't think Goodwin's a great coach and that their list is underperforming. Coaching changeovers, what were Hawthorne thinking, Kip? I mean, it was great pleasure for us, but fuck, that's just one of the dumbest ideas I've seen, is to get rid of the bloke who's coached them to 4 flags on the off chance that Sam Mitchell might be the coaching messiah they're looking for.
It's a battle of egos. I mean, Jeff Kennett has one of the biggest egos of all time. He's obviously never played at the highest level. He's never coached at the highest level, but he obviously thinks that his opinion about who should be coached outweighs all that and outweighs all that history. And it's clear that he has wanted Clarkson gone for a long time. Obviously doesn't approve of the way Clarkson coaches or likes him and wants his control on the club. And then obviously they got spooked by the potential to lose Sam Mitchell. It's the Buckley situation all over again. So I think Buckley was going to coach North Melbourne. I think that was the rumour that he was going to go there. And Eddie obviously panicked because he can't possibly have a favourite son coaching anywhere else. So he panicked and did the Malthouse transfer. And the same thing's pretty much happened here. You have the same president with the big ego. You have the very successful coach who the players love. And I think we saw with the result that Hawthorne pulled out on the weekend, the players obviously really like to play for Clarkson for the favourite son. And I think we can only hope that it goes as well for Hawthorne as it did for Collingwood, Sporno.
I think your analysis there was spot on, Kip. I couldn't have said it better myself, and I'm with Bonds on this. I think, it's one of the funniest things I've seen in a long time, and may we get many, many, many laughs out of this for years to come, because it was, just a joy to watch. I mean, if you're any club and you had a choice between Clarkson and Sam Mitchell, we all know which one coach you're picking. So, every time a coach has left in the last 10, 15 years, everyone's gone. The first person you call is Clarkson. And, well, Hawthorne have jumped at ghosts or jumped at shadows or something. And it's just hilarious to watch. And I'm getting a lot of amusement out of it.
Absolutely. But I think on a serious note, coaches do have a use-by date. I think there's been I've seen a lot of talk about how we're very quick to get rid of coaches as they age. If you look at other sports, particularly in the US, they do have a lot of older coaches with that experience, and that's important. But I guess how long does a record like Clarkson's buy you? It's 6 years since his last premiership. The club has gone backwards. Do you pull that trigger like we did with Sheeds? History shown that hasn't exactly been successful for us. Would Essendon's situation be different if we re-signed Sheeds for 3 years? I don't know. So I hope this backfires in Hawthorne's face and he goes to Clarkson goes to somewhere like Gold Coast and turns them into a superpower and beats Hawthorne in many finals, for example. But yeah, it's just an interesting question about when the right time to move on a coach is.
It's interesting that you mentioned Sheeds because our history over the last 20 years for handing over coaches is not great. Let's be honest. I mean, the most successful handover I think we've had since Sheeds took over from Barry Davis in the start of 1981 was when Gary O'Donnell handed over back to Sheeds in 2006 after his one game as coach back then. Little fun fact, I'm not sure if either of you remember Gary O'Donnell coaching us to a draw against Carlton in 2006 when Sheeds was ill.
I'm pretty sure I was at that game, and yeah, draws kissing his sister. But go on.
That was the game that Fletcher chased down.
Oh, that was great. Yeah, the little fella from Carlton, little forward. Yep. Yeah,
but having said that, I mean, the Sheedy, people might go, oh, well, the Sheedy one wasn't that messy. Well, it kind of was because 2007 was this year we let him go, and we let him go just before the Adelaide game in round 17, and we were actually still fighting for a top 8 spot at that stage. And we were in contention against Adelaide, who were also fighting for a spot. We actually turned up, beat Adelaide in round 17, and then unfortunately after that only won one game for a year. And you do have to kind of think that the players at the time were probably going, well, Sheeds isn't going to be here. We've cost our coach his job. I mean, have we been good enough this year? Well, clearly not. So therefore, the effort sort of left, and especially with Sheeds back in 2007, because he was actually red hot favourite to get that Melbourne job for a very long time after Neil Danaher left, before Melbourne went sideways and gave it to Dean Bailey, who I actually don't think it was a bad choice, but that's for another time, another podcast. So I think that was a fairly messy handover from our point of view, and then the Matthew Knights era ended in one of the worst ways possible, with the fact that we dumped him and then brought in a very inexperienced James Hird, who was mentored by a Mark Thompson, whose interests lay elsewhere by that stage. And then obviously the Thompson back to Hird did not end well. The end of Hird was not great. Worsfold to Rutten was pretty messy. I mean, the Essendon Football Club, even though I am very much enjoying laughing at Hawthorne at the moment, we don't have a great record, do we, in recent times, Sporno, the end of coaches' reigns at our club?
No, it's been a bit Richmond-like, unfortunately. But I think Kip made an interesting point there, that coaches do have a use-by date. And, maybe Clarkson was... I think where Clarkson made his mistake was maybe when they didn't make finals in 2017. He didn't realise then that, hey, he needed to go back to the draft then, but he tried to top up with players still, Chad Wingard, Jago O'Meara, the Sydney GWS rejects. So I think that's probably where he made his mistake. If he had done some changes then, maybe gone through a mini rebuild or something, maybe they would have been in a better position now. But they gave up a lot of draft currency at that time. And I think as we've seen, you have a couple of bad drafts 4 or 5 years ago, and it starts to bear fruit half a dozen years later, and it can be hard to get out of that funk.
Yeah, it reminds me of sort of that mid to late 2000s when we were picking up, Scott Camporeale and Justin Murphy and Matthew Allen and, a few guys just to sort of top off the list when, and obviously it was self-inflicted through the salary cap, inability to manage that, losing your Carousellers and your Blumfields and the like. But it did sort of was reminiscent of that. A successful coach got after a successful period, trying to relive the glory thinking that the coaching would be enough without the cattle. I think that's sort of where Clarkson was at. His coaching ability would outweigh the skill of the team, and I think you do sort of see that a bit. Hawthorne would pull out these amazing victories against top teams, and you could see the imprint of Clarkson on it. But he also would have been a driving force behind the decisions to trade those draft picks, and in many ways probably cost him his longevity in the job. I think sometimes you need humility to know when your club is not going to be able to challenge and be able to drop down. I think Sydney last year is a good example. They didn't try very hard to win too many games, and they've popped straight back up with a few handy acquisitions to really add to their strong core of talent.
Thanks for reminding us of the Camperale and Ty Zantuck years, mate. I think we're all really happy to hear about those years again. But he probably saw Geelong do it, and he was trying to do something similar. I mean, Geelong's been able to top up, but it's a lot easier to top up when you pick up a Dangerfield and a Jeremy Cameron.
Yeah, look, so the last thing I just want to touch on coaching before we end for the season, and I'm going all the way back to 2007, and Kip, I'll grab your thoughts first. Sheets has been on record of saying that he went to Peter Jackson around the 2007 mark, early 2007, knowing that James Hird would retire, that if they gave Sheeds a new 3-year contract, that then Hird would then spend 2 years, I think, as an assistant underneath Sheeds, learn the ropes, and then he'd take the reins. Around the 2010, 2011 mark, that he took it anyway, and Sheeds would then fade into the background as a director of coaching style, which I think he was modelling himself on the David Parkin role at Hawthorne at the time. It's a massive sliding doors moment, and I don't want to channel my inner Damien Barrett for the Essendon Football Club, but if that had happened, do you think that James Hird would have been a successful coach? I mean, I still think James Hird was a good game day tactical coach. I thought he offered a lot of the job. I just thought that he had probably a little bit of naivety around the off-field side of things. I say naivety, we saw what happened, so clearly he was misled, but that wouldn't have happened on the Sheets. I just don't think that there's just no way that Kevin Sheedy would have let that happen. So do you think James Hird would still be our coach now if the changeover that Sheedy took to Peter Jackson in early 2007 had eventuated the way that Sheeds planned it out?
Not too many coaches last 14 years, even the good ones, so it's hard to say whether he'd still be our coach now. I think that would be a lot of pressure on a Hird. You go straight out of playing, you stay at the same club, and then you go straight into coaching without having experienced other setups. So he would be an Essendon person, and he obviously would have the support of the fans. He wouldn't have the fans of the board angling to get rid of him like a Knights would. He'd get a lot of leeway in terms of performances, a bit like Buckley got. Whether he'd be successful, I think he's a very intelligent man. He obviously gets players to play for him. I think he'd be very inspirational. It's hard to say how tactically aware he is. He did have some really good moments as a coach tactically. It's hard to say. I don't want to speculate on that. I think we probably did. If the other thing is, I guess, is if Hird does come in having apprentice to Sheeds, he's a Sheedy style coach. He's the only coach he's known. Maybe the club needed a departure from a Sheedy style coach. There's a lot to say about how Peter Jackson handled the club, particularly his unwillingness to open purse strings when the club obviously needed in terms of facilities and looking to get players. I don't necessarily think it was the wrong decision to not extend Sheeds. I think you make a good point. The time in the season when it was made is probably the wrong time to make that decision. I just feel that Sheedy's time was probably done, and I think we needed a break from the Sheedy style coach, at which Hird I think would have been. I mean, he'd have his own individuality to it, but he'd also, he'd have a lot of Sheedy in him.
The only thing I would say to you there about the Sheedy coaching is we saw that James Hird was still a very different style coach to Kevin Sheedy when he came through. He did have that little bit of, I suppose, mischief with the media, but it wasn't as obvious as what Sheeds had. I mean, Hird didn't start talking about marshmallows and Martians, and I can't see Hird ever tying a windsock down like Sheeds did against West Coast back in 1991, I believe it was. So while I get your point that he would have been only under Sheedy his entire career, I still think he would have been his own man. And I don't think learning from Sheedy was necessarily a bad thing. I mean, again, I take your point that if you've only ever been at one club, yeah, that's all you know. But Sheedy was very successful. Hurd was part of a very successful side at Essendon. So if you only know one club, if they're really a successful club, is that really that bad? Is that a problem? I mean, you can argue that Sheedy didn't evolve, and Hurd would have not seen that evolution. So I mean, Hurd would have seen that Sheedy struggled to evolve, and he probably would have seen what was needed from a modern coaching point of view. So while I take your points, I just don't know if I place as much importance on that as perhaps yourself has.
Well, I guess the counterpoint to what I said, and more along of what you said, look at Bomber Thompson. He spent most of his career under Sheedy, did some work as an assistant coach for him, got the Geelong job, and then is one of the most successful coaches of the last 20 years. So I don't necessarily disagree with you. I guess I'm just a bit pessimistic about Hurd's success in that environment.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's pure speculation. We'll never know. It's just something I thought was interesting to look back on as a result of what we saw come out of Hawthorne this week, which once again is probably the most pleasure Hawthorne's given me in the past decade. So thumbs up to Jeff Kennett for doing that for us. But that will do us for this evening, lads. We've had a great chat this evening, so I'd like to thank you both for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me, and I'm already putting my hand up to not come on next week because I really don't want to talk about another 10-goal Bulldogs loss.
Thanks, Ponce. It's been great fun to be here again, and loved being on here with Kip as well. Cheers.
Well, on that rather positive note from Kip, we will call it a night. If anybody would like to jump on next week because Kip's already decided we're going to lose by 10 goals, feel free to reach out. Other than that, have a lovely week, guys.